Anyway, good morning and good afternoon, and it's wonderful to see everybody. And welcome to Jared, who's with us. There we go. There we go. Welcome to Jared, who's with us. So we have been. I decided that for the thank you. She's quite a beautiful baby, brilliant too, by the way. She's already talking, learning Talmud. My son-in-law said she wakes up every 2.5 hours. We haven't gotten any sleep. When does it get better? And I said, in about 35 years, it's a little bit of divine justice. The topic for this next semester or so is I want to learn Talmud together. And I told you, I want to do this for three principal reasons. Number one, because Talmud is the core text of our Judaism. Now, the Bible is our constitution. The Bible is the foundational text of Jewish life, but we don't live biblical lives. We don't live biblical life. We don't do sacrifices, and the whole sense of the Bible is not ours. But what we do is we live rabbinic lives. The lives of our Judaism are rabbinic lives, and because of that, it's important to open the text where the formation of that Judaism is available to us, and that's the Talmud. And the reason why American Jews or Jews in general don't read Talmud is because it's a very strange literature. It's a literature that sort of demands that you know it all already before you jump into it. It's sort of like having, the only analogy I could think of, it's like having a roll of tape with no beginning. You ever look for the beginning of a roll of tape or saran wrap or something? And I always think that they're going to throw one into the box, which has no beginning, and drive you nuts, drive you crazy. And that's sort of what Talmud study is, because the vocabulary, the ways of thinking, the way it works, you sort of have to be immersed in it already before you can understand how to begin to do it. And for that reason, it was always called an oral tradition, even though it's been written down for many thousands of years. It remains an oral tradition in a real way, because you really need somebody to take you by the hand and introduce you into it and initiate you into it and take you through the first several iterations of it in order for you to catch on to what the heck this is. Because what the heck this is really different than, for example, anything in the Bible. The Bible is narrative. It tells you a story. We all know what that's about. The Bible takes you to historical events, or at least semi-historical events, and we know what that's about. The Bible has poetry. The Bible has prayer. The Bible has wisdom teaching. We know what that's about. Talmud ain't any of that. Talmud is a conversation that takes place among great teachers and rabbis, and the real focus and topic of the conversation is, what does God want of us? How do we live a life in accordance with God's will? Now, what's really interesting, so that conversation includes law, an analysis of the Mishnah, which is the first iteration of rabbinic literature, and the laws of the tradition. It includes legends and theology. It includes folk wisdom. It's a whole bunch of all of that stuff, because it's all around this topic of how does one lead a godly life? How does one lead a holy life? How do you create the holy society? And it all is rooted in the notion that the Bible that we have in front of us is the product of an infinite mind. And if the Bible is a product of an infinite mind, then all sorts of techniques of interpretation are open to us to draw out of the Bible that whole way of life. That's the presumption of the Talmudic literature. Now, part of what makes this really interesting is that the rabbis are not they're not sticklers about staying on topic. Because this was an oral literature, this was once just remembered and spoken out loud and not written down. So there's a lot of digression, because something reminds you of something. And it takes you there. It's a whole lot more like your family Passover table discussion or your Shabbos table discussion than it is like a Supreme Court justice deliberation. I mean, more or less, the Supreme Court justices are talking about a case. You imagine they stay on topic for a while. But if you're sitting with my aunts and uncles and my cousins and friends, there's no topic. It sort of drifts off, and then it comes back to the topic after a little while. And that really is the style of the Talmud. That's one fact about this that's interesting. The second fact about this is that the conversations we're reading, they're constructed. They didn't really happen. And the reason I know they didn't really happen is because you have conversations that are set up among people who lived in different places in different centuries. So imagine if you could create a literature that included the great minds of civilization sitting around a table talking about what it is that how one ought to live one's life. I mean, imagine if you brought Albert Einstein and you brought Immanuel Kant and you brought Leonard Bernstein and you brought Beethoven and you brought Steven Spielberg and you brought Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you brought them all to the table to have a conversation about the meaning of life. That's what the Talmud is. It's a constructed conversation that is trying to encompass this inquiry into how one ought to live a life. So the first reason I want you to learn this is because you're a Jew and you care for your literacy, and you ought to know this just because you're a Jew and you value your literacy. That's number one. Number two, the second reason I want you to read this is because I want you to see how the Talmud deals with the Bible. Because here is a literature that takes with great seriousness the sanctity of the Bible, but great freedom, tremendous freedom in messing with the Bible, in reconstructing it, shaping it, turning it in ways that you can't begin to imagine. And the question you keep asking is like, where do they get off doing that? Like, where do they get off pulling things out of context, messing with the words, playing these really strange interpretive games? And the answer is because that's the point. The point is to demonstrate a certain courage and a certain creativity in manipulating biblical material in order to arrive at certain conclusions. The third reason I want you to see this is because what we have here is a model of a civilization, a model of discourse. I would call it politics, but in the broadest sense of that word. Aristotle, the philosopher, said politics is a conversation about the common good. And Aristotle said that human beings are capable of civil conversation about very deep issues without killing each other. That's the great glory of politics. And what the Talmud really does is demonstrate that idea. Here you have rabbis who are living in the shadow of a destroyed temple, first under vicious Roman rule, and then later under more benign Persian rule. But they're living in diaspora. They're living separated from any center of material power in the world. And they're creating a new religious civilization. And they're doing it in a way which is inclusive. They're including all sorts of perspectives, all sorts of opinions, all sorts of ideologies, and doing so with a great deal of respect, a remarkable amount of respect. And one of the core texts for establishing that pattern of discourse, a pattern of discourse that recognizes that we can have a diversity of opinions, but still have communal solidarity. One of the texts is the one that we're reading, okay? So we started last time with the text from Talmud Bava Metzia. Bava Metzia means the middle gate. The section of the Talmud called Nizikin, which is lawsuits, Jews suing Jews. Now, I don't know if you can imagine this, but sometimes Jews get a little litigious. In fact, Nizikin, which is Jews suing Jews, got so long, they had to divide it into three different sections. So Bava Kama means the first gate, Bava Metzia is the second gate, and Bava Basra is the third gate. And it's divided into chapters. And the section that we're reading on the chapter was all about fraud in business. You went to a store and you bought something, and by the time you got home, you realized that they didn't sell you what you bargained for. Okay, and there's all sorts of laws on how you redress that grievance and how you go back and get, and what are the penalties for fraud and that sort of thing. And then in the middle of the conversation, they turn and they say something really, which is what we saw last time. They say something really interesting. Just as there is fraud, just as there is hurting one another with money, there's also the capacity to hurt one another using words, even if money's not involved. Onat devarim, the damage, the hurt, that we inflict on one another using the words we use. And you can see why that is such a critical thing. You're living in a community, and that community has no power. You have no government. That community has no land. That community has very loose boundaries. So the solidarity of that community is something that the rabbis have a huge stake in protecting. And one of the things that we're going to have to do to protect the solidarity of the community is to be very attentive to the fabric of relationships that bind us together in this community. And that's going to depend on how we talk to each other. Because if we use our words to damage one another, to hurt one another, to hurl words at each other, you're not long going to have a community. This community is just going to fade away. No one wants to be in a place where they feel danger. And so ona'at dvarim, the damage we inflict on each other using our words, becomes a critical issue. And creating a community where you can express your opinion, even if it's an outlying opinion, without being damaged, without being hurt, is a big deal in this community. And that's the topic of the section that we're reading right now. So we began with this notion that just as there's fraud, just as there's damage that you can inflict with money, there's damage you can inflict with words. And we have a series of opinions. First, we have a series of examples. You don't tell the sinner, I remember when you were a repentant sinner. I remember when you were a real sinner. I remember the stuff you used to pull off. Oh, you don't do that because that cancels his tshuva. You don't tell the convert, I remember the awful, terrible things your parents used to do. Right? You don't ask the price of an item in a store if you don't have any intention of buying. You don't lie to someone if they ask you directions on the land. This, by the way, is an interesting one. Someone says, how do I get to Sepulveda from here? You don't point them in the other direction. You don't do this to people. It's wrong, says the Talmud. Now, notice these are all things that there's no to enforce this. These are ethics. This is you can't take somebody to court and say he sent me the wrong way from Sepulveda. The guy's just going to say I made a mistake. However, the Talmud takes this with great seriousness. So there's a series of rulings from these various Talmudic rabbis of different generations where they say this is so serious. And the most serious one is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's the most radical of the rabbis in general. He was Rabbi Akiva's student. And he's the one who says, it's worse than killing somebody. It's really worse than killing somebody. And that becomes the sort of standard, okay? And then as they're talking about this issue of using words to hurt each other, they introduce a story that we spent a lot of time on last time. It's the story of this oven. And the truth is that the oven is irrelevant. I mean, who cares? First of all, it's irrelevant to them because there's no such thing as purity laws anymore because the temple's destroyed and they're all living in Babylon. It's certainly irrelevant to us. But the question is, how do you decide it? It's a question of legal procedure more than a question of the precise outcome, the verdict. And in this case, there's an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the other rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer, who is usually the one whose opinion carries the day, he loses the argument. The other guys say, no, I'm not going to accept this oven as pure. And he gets so frustrated that he brings down all these miracles. Remember? All these miracles, makes the tree dance, and he brings the water flows up the hill. And finally, in an act of spite, he says, if I'm right, we're all going to die finding out, and the walls begin to smoosh in. And his partner, Rabbi Yoshua, stands up and says, back off, walls. And that's why all the walls are crooked in every synagogue I've ever worked in. And the roof leaks, and the microphones never come on right, and the air conditioning is always bad because of the two great rabbis, second century. And then finally, Rabbi Eliezer pulls off the coup de grace. He says, if I'm right, let God prove it. And God shows up. Now, only in a good story can you have this. Anybody here remember the movie Annie Hall? Anybody remember Annie Hall? So you have to be a certain age, Jared. I'm sorry. For you, it's an old movie. But for us, it was, just yesterday. So there's a scene in Annie Hall when he's waiting in line at the Thalia Theater on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where I used to go see films. And there's some guy spouting off about Marshall McLuhan, right? And Woody Allen says to the guy, like, what makes you think you know anything about Marshall McLuhan? He said, well, I teach media studies at Columbia. And Woody Allen goes and he pulls behind a sign, he pulls out Marshall McLuhan. Okay. And Marshall McLuhan looks at the guy and says, you don't know shit, basically. You don't know anything about me. You don't know anything about what I taught. And Woody Allen looks directly in the camera and says, wouldn't it be great if this really happened in life? I mean, it's just the greatest scene in the world, right? Well, that's what Rabbi Eliezer does. Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let God show up and prove it. God shows up and says he's right. He's always right. Why are you arguing with him? And at that point, Rabbi Yoshua stands up, as it were, because he was this little bent over man. And he says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in heaven. And last time we talked about what the meaning of that was. It recognizes a certain religious maturity to say it is our responsibility to determine the meaning of Torah. It's our responsibility to discuss what this means and how to live a godly life. And we're not going to depend upon voices from heaven to solve our problems, because if we did that, then we reduce Judaism to an infantile exercise, an infantile religion. It's about adults making difficult choices and living by the consequences of their choices, even if they know that they might be wrong. And that's where we got up to last time. Okay, everybody good so far? All right, before we jump back into the text, any questions, comments, or counter sermons? Douglas, you're up. Please unmute, and then David.
I just did. If there's a whole cottage industry of who wrote the Bible and applying that, how come when you ask the question to you, who wrote the Talmud, you get...
Well, because the Talmud wasn't written in that way. The Talmud was assembled. All right. And there is a very strong scholarly literature about this. Okay. The Talmud, you have rulings offered by rabbis, both in courts. Remember, rabbis played three roles. They were judges, they were law professors, and they were spiritual guides. Okay. So you have rulings offered in courts, you have lectures given in law classes, and you have sermons given on Shabbat and holidays. Okay. We have these. We have lots of them. What the Talmud did was gather them up and codify them and organize them into this literary form. Okay? That's what we have. That's what the Talmud is. So we have a pretty good idea when this was done. It was done initially. It was sorted out by the two last of the Amoraim, Rabbi Ashi and Rav Ashi and Ravina. And then it was put together by the next generation, who were a group of scholars that we call the Saboraim, who were 8th and 9th century Babylonian or Iraqi rabbis. And they were the ones who put this together, okay? And their Talmud really becomes authoritative in those 8th and 9th centuries. But the truth is, it doesn't really become the authoritative document until the 10th century, when Rashi in France picks it up and writes a commentary which makes it accessible to everybody. And that's when it becomes really the core text of Jewish life. So we really do have a sense of when this was written, okay? This is not handed down from heaven. Lo b'shamayim. This was written by rabbis, mostly in Iraq, okay? Some in Israel, some in Iraq, but mostly in Iraq, okay? And edited together at a certain moment in history, okay? Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, David, you're up.
You know, there are two things that you've said that I don't know. I'm just going to, what crossed my mind.
Please.
If you have anything to say about it. One is, the biggest one is I'm always looking for the current application of what you're teaching to my life, to today's world. And so you're talking about ethics and right behavior, and you don't do this and you don't do that. And then I think about the level of contentiousness in our world now and in the recent past in particular. And then I think, well, that level of contentiousness has always existed, hasn't it? Always. And maybe in a sense worse. You talked about, well, we have the capacity to talk about things and not kill each other. And so I don't know if you want to say anything about that. And the other thing, which is a different thing, is that you talked in the beginning about, that we learned how to be holy. And the thing that I thought of is why. And maybe the two things that I'm saying are related.
Well, I mean, part of it is, and you know me well enough, part of it is I'm interested in how a society conducts a serious conversation about serious moral issues and accepts the fact that there are multiple perspectives and multiple opinions and multiple conclusions, but doesn't lose its solidarity. Because I look outside and see what's going on in this world. I feel it in my own community, and I think we're losing this capacity, which means we're losing the capacity to be a community. We were talking before. So, my dear friend, Rabbi Welpe, and his temple has been under tremendous attack from his people, all for the reason because he and the school that is in his temple, and ours too, by the way, observes a rule of the county health department demanding that children wear masks during school, and demanding that parents be vaccinated. The mask rule isn't our rule. It belongs to the county health department. And the vaccinating rule is I think, a kind of common sense thing. But this has become such a contentious issue. And instead of just saying, well, listen, we all want to be healthy and well, and we don't know everything there is to know about this virus. So, all right, so this is what we're going to do, and we can disagree, and I'll lodge my disagreement, but I'll do it in a menschlich way. Instead, you get this personal invective, the kind of names that people call him. I've gotten called names, if I tell you that the only time in my life not the only time, it was one called the Nazi, is over this issue. Because I said to, a family had an affair, and we said, you have to be vaccinated to come onto the campus. And, friends or family of that person said, oh, you're excluding us from a synagogue. You're a Nazi. I get it. You're disappointed, but why does it slip into that vicious of an invective so very quickly? And so I'm looking for a model for how we can live in a position where we disagree with each other about important stuff, but we don't kill each other that way, at least verbally. And that's one of the reasons why I think Talmud is so valuable at this moment. Okay, so I really appreciate the question. Stanley, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. First, a quick comment. Steve Allen did exactly what you were talking about, of putting characters and history together and having a conversation many years ago.
Yeah.
And
did it with some great joy. It was great. It was very funny. Yeah.
Very talented. I attended a class way back on Jewish comedians, and the only non-Jew they put in there was Steve Allen. Said he's just as Jewish as the rest of them.
Well, because a name like Steve Allen, you figure he had to have been like a Lorzovich or something, Wonder what it was before it was Allen.
Question I have is, when was the Torah, as we know it, put together in, as a cycle of reading, and the Haftorah things put in it, relative to what we're talking about now, which is the ethics and the Talmud and whatever? When was first, and when?
Right. So the Torah is first read in public on Rosh Hashanah in probably the year 444 by Ezra. It's recorded in the 9th and 10th chapter of the book of Ezra, and I think it's the 8th chapter of Nehemiah in the Bible, where they come out on Rosh Hashanah and they erect this giant tower, and he reads the Torah to the people. So the first reading of the Torah takes place, after the exile, and the community now owns the Torah. So the tradition of reading the Torah began with Ezra, with the return from exile and the reestablishment of a Jewish community in Yerushalayim and in Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of the temple. When it was divided, there's many different traditions about when it was divided, right? My Orthodox brothers and sisters will tell you that Ezra was the one who divided into Torah portions. It's clear that it was done somewhere early, but probably not that early, and there's two different divisions. There's 54 parshiot in the Babylonian cycle, and 152 parshiot, sidras, in the Palestinian cycle. So in Israel, they would read it in 3 years, and in Babylon, they read it in 1 year. This kind of stuff. So it's an early thing. We don't know exactly when and who did it. Okay, so that's an early, but the urge to share the text, and the idea that the text becomes the core of life, and therefore everyone has to have literacy in order to engage the text, that is a product of Second Temple Judaism from the very beginning. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Jared, you want to jump in? You got anything you want to add?
I'm just listening right now, but I think just the idea that the Talmud is not only recited but performed, I think helps me understand how to read this.
Good. It would be interesting to write it into a cantata, and put them around the table and dress them up. That would be kind of fun. And certain sugyas would get out of hand. Mr. Garber, sir, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It seems to me that most of the disagreements in the Talmud over what the law means or what the law is end inconclusively until somebody writes what they believe to be the law and everybody else disagrees with it. And I remember growing up in a small immigrant neighborhood where we had 7 synagogues but one rabbi, and he didn't belong to any of them. And when somebody had a question about what the law is, they would call the Rav, and he would give a decision. And I think today, if somebody questioned you about what the law is, and also talk to another rabbi at a different conservative temple, they might get a different answer. So to call the Talmud a law book, I don't think is quite accurate.
No, you're exactly right. It can't be a law book because it doesn't tell us at the end of each discussion who won, right? It doesn't tell you. You have to go find that. In fact, there's a footnote system in the Talmudic text that we learn from that tells you which opinion was codified in which code of law. And that's one of the ways to figure out who actually ends up as the law. It's not a book that tells you this is the law. If you want that book, I can give you that book. The first one of those books is Maimonides' Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is exactly what he wanted to do. He said, listen, the Talmud's too confusing. I'll give you the law and I'll make it easy. And he really did. And then you have the later codes of law. Shulchan Aruch is another one.
Yeah.
What the Talmud does is give you the process by which they got to that law, right? Which is much more interesting, frankly. I mean, it's nice to you listen to the news in the evening and they'll say the Supreme Court voted today 5-4 to say this. Well, that's okay. It's nice to know that. I want to know what the Supreme Court ruled and what's the law of the land. But if you're really interested in law and ethics and morals and society, it's a whole lot more interesting to read the opinions. And if you can even read some of the records of the deliberations to find out how they ended up getting there, what they were, who got on whose side, who asked which questions, what was argued. That really, it's more like a transcript of the court than it is a decree of what the law is at the end. So in that, you're very right. And you should know that it's a good thing to know that you can ask 2 rabbis and get 3 opinions,
Yeah, right.
Because if the rabbi ever said something you don't like, you can always cross the street and find a guy who will say it's kosher, So it's that's a much, if you don't like what I tell you, go ask Jared. He'll give you a much better opinion,
You don't have to be baptized again.
No, it's true. And I always tell my Orthodox friends, say, no, that's the problem with you, conservative Jews. It's like, you don't give us the law. And I say, come on, you guys. You know what you do. If one rabbi says one thing, you just cross Pico and you get the other opinion. I mean, the rabbis on the north of Pico are much more conservative than the rabbis on the south of Pico. And if you go down to Olympic, it's even worse. I mean, so, all right, let's take a look inside. Are you ready? We've been talking about the Talmud. Let's get to it. All right, so this is where we got to last time, right? This is a story that is added to, stuck on to the end of this discussion of the damage we do by words, okay? And the story is, if you cut the earthenware oven into segments and put sand between each one, Rabbi Eliezer said the oven is pure. It can't accept impurity because breaking it up into pieces means it's no longer whole, and therefore it can't accept impurity. And all the other rabbis said no, and they call this the oven of Aknai. Right? On that day, Rabbi Eliezer offered every argument in the world. The rabbis didn't accept them. So he said, if the halacha agrees with me, look at the tree, and the tree rockets in the air. And the other rabbis say, cool, miracle. But no proof can be brought from a tree. So he says, okay, you want a better miracle? I'll show you a better miracle. If the halacha is according to me, let the stream of water flow uphill. And it flew uphill. It flowed uphill. It flew uphill. And the rabbi said, it's really cool, but that's not, you can't bring proof from a stream. And then he says, if I'm right, let the walls of the study hall, and the walls of the study halls are to fall in on the rabbi. So he says, if I'm right, we're all going to die finding out, right? And Rabbi Yoshua stands up and he says, yo, walls, back off. And the walls didn't know what to do. Some fell, some stood up. No one knows what to do. Finally, he says, if the halacha agrees with me, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice came forth and said, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? In all things, halacha agrees with him. Well, that should do it, guys. I mean, you bring God himself. That's even better than Marshall McLuhan in the movie. You bring God himself into the discussion. That should, like, all right, game over, right? I mean, that's the ultimate replay, right? For those of you who watched the Super Bowl, right? If there had been replay on every play, it would have been a different game. It's the ultimate replay. That's a football metaphor for those of you who don't watch sports. Rabbi Yoshua stands up and he says, Lo b'shamayim hi. He quotes a verse of the Bible. And the verse of the Bible is Moses saying to the people, you don't need to worry that Torah is far away from you. It's not. We own it. It's ours. Right? And the rabbis then analyze that. What do they mean by that? So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. We don't attend to divine voices. We follow the majority. And then finally, there's this postscript where Rabbi Nosson is having tea with Elijah, and he says, tell me something. You live in heaven. What happened when Rabbi Yoshua said to God, buzz off? And instead of getting angry, God says, Nitzchundi banai. My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Now, that's the story. Now, watch what happens next. Rabbi Eliezer, in what he has done, in evoking miracles and bringing God into the Beis Midrash, bringing God into the courtroom to discuss the case, to decide the case, he has undermined the whole rabbinic process. He has undermined the whole rationale by which Torah is studied and applied to life. And for this, they get angry at him. And they decide to do something to him, which is equally brutal. They excommunicate him. On that day, the sages brought all the items that Rabbi Eliezer had deemed pure, and they burned them in fire, and they voted, and they excommunicated him. Now, excommunication today doesn't mean very much. You get thrown out of VBS, you go to Adat Ariel. You get thrown out of Adat Ariel, you go to Temple Judea. Big deal. But in that days, when to be kicked out of the Jewish community was a big deal, especially if you're a rabbi, because it means you have no place in the world. You lose your identity. And what this means is when they say that they burned everything Rabbi Eliezer declared pure, what they're doing is they're rejecting his person, his authority. They're rejecting his Torah. They're rejecting him. Now, remember, the whole sugya, the whole section is about using your words and being careful about the violence you inflict on a human being using your words. So the question is, was this right? And how did they do it? They said, who's going to go inform him of his ostracism? Who's going to go tell? Remember, this is a man who could bring God into the world with a word. So you got to be careful because he'll snap his fingers and turn you into a worm. I mean, he'll destroy you in a minute. Who has the chutzpah? Who has the guts to go confront him? Because if you piss him off, he'll kill you. I mean, that really was the idea. This is a man who can make trees jump and waters flow backwards and walls fall down and bring God into the world. You do not want to piss him off, right? Remember the song, right? You don't stand on Superman's cape, you don't spin in the wind, and you don't go tell Rabbi Eliezer that he's been excommunicated. So Rabbi Akiva, who's his student, who was the greatest rabbi who ever lived, who was the greatest student, he says, I'll go tell him. Because if somebody unfit goes, he can end up destroying the whole world, right? So what did Rabbi Akiva do? The Talmud says he wore black and wrapped himself in black and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits. So he goes to his house and he sits on the floor 6 feet away from him. And Rabbi Eliezer could read the signal, right? And now you begin to see this bold, powerful man who was able to bring God in the world. He's broken. He says, basically, Akiba Manish Tana. Why is today different from all other days? Why are you sitting so far away? Why are you wearing black? Why are you sitting on the floor? And Akiba says, my teacher, it appears to me, and that's the language, Nidmeli, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. So Rabbi Eliezer tore his garments, removed his shoes, and dropped from his seat and sat on the ground. Those are all mourning rituals. So what is he mourning? What is he grieving for? He's just been kicked out of his life. He's grieving for who he was. He's grieving for himself. It's almost like he's sitting Shiva for himself. He's sitting Shiva for himself because what does he do in the world? Who is he in the world without the Beis Midrash? Who is he in the world without the rabbinic conversation? Right? And his eyes shed tears. And then the Talmud says the entire world was afflicted. Rabbi Eliezer is so broken, 1/3 of the olives, 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley. People even say even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. At that minute, there was a plague and 1/3 of the food of the world was destroyed. On that day, a great wind blew. As any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was incinerated. The man is in such grief. He's so broken. Now, he did something terrible. It's true. He undermined the whole rabbinic system. The question is, were they right in ostracizing him? And is this an example of ona'at dvarim? I mean, the context here is ona'at dvarim, the damage, the violence we do using our words. And so the context here is, you can disagree with him, but don't kick him out of the community. So this is an implicit indictment of the rabbis for an overreaction to what he did. It even happened that Rabban Gamliel, the leader of the academy, Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi, he's the head of the academy, okay, was coming on a boat and a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. So he's coming home from Rome. Rabban Gamliel would go on these missions to Rome to appeal for the community, and he's coming home and this tsunami hits the boat. And Gamliel says, it seems to me this is on account of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. He says, there's only one man in the world who has the power to bring a tsunami on the ocean. And that has got to be Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So Rabban Gamliel rises up and he says, Master of the universe, God, you know that I did this neither for my honor nor for the honor of my family. It was for your honor, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel. And in response, the sea was calmed from its rage. All right, so Rabban Gamliel explains to God what he did. I didn't do this for myself. This wasn't an ego move. And I didn't do this to in any way prosper my family. Why did he do it? Why did they excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer? Because if you don't, what happens? If you allow people to do what Rabbi Eliezer did, if you let him get away with it, what happens? What's the consequence of this? Go ahead, Douglas. Yeah, jump in.
Playing dueling magicians or something like that. Who can do the greatest miracle?
Right.
You know, and it sort of lays a foundation on a house of cards.
Right. Because every time you run out of arguments, then you start crashing things. You start destroying things in the world. You start making rivers flow uphill and trees dance and stone walls fall down. And so Rabban Gamliel says, look, I had to do this because if I didn't do this, if I didn't do it, the whole system would have collapsed. We would never have been the religion we were meant to be. And so the sea calms down. Now, if the sea calms down, what does that sort of tell you? That God agreed with it. At least regretfully, God agrees with it, right? And then what happens here at the end? Okay, right? Now, this is the end of the story. Ima Shalom, that's her name. Isn't that a beautiful name? Ima Shalom, the mother of peace, was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer and the sister of Rabban Gamliel. Oh, now what does that tell you, guys? This isn't just a professional dispute. This isn't, they're brothers-in-law. They're brothers-in-law. Wow. So the notion, this isn't just like, like in the family, quote unquote. This is mamish in the family. This is a family dispute, right? Rabban Gamliel is the sister of the wife of Rabbi Eliezer. They're mishpacha, which means their fates are tied together, right? Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, sister of Rabban Gamliel, right? From that incident forward, she would not allow Rabban Gamliel to prostrate himself in the Tachanun prayer. All right, so there's a service, a prayer that is said morning and afternoon called Tachanun. It's a repentance for our sins, and it asks God for the power to purify the world. And she was afraid. He is so powerful as a spiritual master. He is so powerful as a prayer master that if he were to fall into that prayer and begin crying about his pain in the world, God would destroy the world. So she keeps him from praying that prayer.
Rabbi Eliezer, not Rabbi.
Rabbi Eliezer, right. She's keeping her husband, Rabbi Eliezer, from praying that prayer because she's afraid that if he ever prayed it, he would murder everybody. His tears would be so powerful that God would bring destruction on the whole world. Okay, so this is talking about this is this wonderful sort of mythic, contest between magicians, right? And on that day, and then one day was the new moon, and she was confused about the calendar. Remember, a Hebrew day is 29 and a quarter, 29, a Hebrew month is 29 and a quarter days. So some days the month is 28 days long, and the 29th day is Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. And some days it's 29 days long, and the 30th day is Rosh Chodesh. You don't know. And she got mixed up, and she forgot, and you don't say Tachanun on Rosh Chodesh. So she got it mixed up, and she wasn't watching him. And he fell on his face to do Tachanun, right? Alternatively, there's a better answer, another story that was told, which is, no, it's not that she messed up the calendar. She's too smart for that. A pauper came and stood at the door. A poor man comes to the door, and her heart was open for this man. So for a moment, she's distracted. She goes, gives the poor man stokka, right? And as she's giving him stokka, she comes back, and there he is lying prostrate on the ground. He's doing Tachanun. And she says to him, arise, you've killed my brother. And at that moment, the sound of a shofar came from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that he had died, that the Nasi had died. The king, the prince, the leader of the community had died, right? Rabbi Eliezer said to her, how did you know that your brother would die? And she said, it's a tradition I received from my family. All the gates of heaven are locked, except for the gates of the prayer for victims of Ona Atvarim, those who are hurt by language. And I knew that if you could pray, you would kill him. Now, what are we left with at the end of the story? This is positively Shakespearean, because at the end of the story, the whole stage is littered with dead bodies. Everybody's dead, right? Rabban Gamliel, who's the leader of the community, is dead. Rabbi Eliezer, who is the greatest rabbi of the generation, is in exile. He can't be a rabbi anymore. His life is over, right? And he just killed his brother-in-law, right? Rabbi Yoshua, who's the only one left, is going to continue to be the teacher, and Rabbi Kiba is going to become the new leader of the community. But what's left is a shambles. Now think about this for just a second. These are the guys who are living in the second generation of rabbis after the destruction. Their teacher, the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Remember Yochanan ben Zakkai? He's the guy that snuck out of the city during the revolt. Who were the people that carried him out of the city during the revolt? It was Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. This is the cast of characters. So they remember the destruction. This is first generation post-Holocaust Judaism. And what does the Talmud tell you here? What is the Talmud telling you here? If you can't figure out how to live together, how to disagree civilly, how to discuss the meaning of Torah and find a way of life, if you can't maintain the solidarity of this community in respect by being careful with the words that you use, you will destroy the temple all over again. Because this whole generation of rabbis is wiped out in one moment because you guys decided that Rabbi Eliezer did what he did and Rabbi Gamliel did what he did, and you guys all thought you were doing the right thing, and you end up with another decimated generation. These are people who saw the destruction. They saw the Romans destroy the Holy Temple and exile God from the world. And what the Talmud is trying to say is that if you can't get your act together and figure out how to have a community that embraces a diversity of opinions and a diversity of perspectives, and you think that the only way to make yourself right is to destroy each other, well, then you're going to create another destruction all over again. This is a second Churban, a second destruction of the temple. Only this one's not done by the Romans. This one we did to ourselves. And what weapons did we use? We used our words, because we Jews are good with this. You know, we can use our words to destroy a community in a minute. That's what it's just a remarkable text, because it's a warning that the destruction isn't just one time, and it's not just at the hands of the Romans. We can do this to ourselves if we're not careful. That's where the story ends, right? And the only hero in the whole story is Ima Shalom, who is just the most nicely named woman in the whole Talmud, because she's the one who says, boys, cut it out. Remember that you're family, but they can't. They have to, each one of them has to be right. And because each one of them is right, this is what you end up with. All right, Stanley, you got a few questions. Go ahead.
Well, you might say that this is what the Shalom Hartman Institute is about, creating pluralism in Judaism, especially in Israel, because you might say that, you know, even in our time, it's being destroyed.
Yeah, imagine that. Post-Holocaust Jews can't stop killing each other. Just imagine that. I mean, that's exactly where we are. So Hartman is one example. There's many people working on this in the community, but I think this is a really powerful statement about what the rabbis saw as necessity if we're going to survive diaspora, because we're no longer united by land. We're no longer united by government. We're no longer united by ideology. Well, what holds us together? Well, Ima Shalom was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer and the sister of Rabbi Gamliel. We're a mishpacha. And we better take care of each other like a mishpacha. And all of you who live in families know that families are really hard to live in and really hard to live with. I'll speak for myself. My family is really hard to live in because everyone has a sister-in-law that makes you roll your eyes like, oh, her, yeah, right? Or a brother-in-law. The question, how do you include all these people? Sandy, you're up.
Well, it's so hard to approach Talmud because I was reading another book and they were talking about the organization Daf Yomi that studies 2 pages every day and they finish in 7 years.
Right.
And I mean, so it shows the depth of study that you have to approach it with.
Well,
and
the funny thing is that's not depth, that's speed. Because 2 pages,
yeah, that is speed, right?
2 pages is an enormous amount of Talmud to learn, and to try to do it and still hold down a full-time job.
Exactly, and they were saying, and it's so complicated. It's very. Yeah.
We just spent 3 weeks on 1 page, so you should. That's what Daf Yomi is.
Right.
We're doing Daf Shvui, so it takes us 3 weeks to do 1 page. Okay. So that's one technique. So one technique is to try to get through the whole thing, and it takes 7 years if you do a page a day.
Yeah, and they also say you can't do it by yourself. You have to do it in a group.
You do it with somebody, but I'd rather do it a different way. I like it this way better. Take a small section and really spend some time on it, and really keep asking the wonderful questions, which is, what does this say to me? Like, what is this doing here now?
Wouldn't it be nice if the community as a whole did study this? Because what they're doing now, talk about humiliation. I mean, there's just, it's sad that we can't put anything into practice. Look at what's going on.
Right. It's sad that this isn't a closer byword of the community. All right. Douglas, your question?
Yeah. Have we learned this lesson in 1,500 years since it's been written?
No.
I think so.
We can recite it, but can you live it? It's hard. It's a very hard problem. How do I sit down with people I disagree with? And how do I embrace them? And how do I see that the disagreement isn't as important to me as keeping alive the solidarity of the table, of the conversation and of the process? That's really the question.
I'm not sure that that's just a Jewish problem either.
It's not a Jewish problem. It's a world problem. It's a right now a very, very serious problem in our democracy. Okay. Well, that's for another sermon. We're doing Talmud today. Jared, you get the last word today. Go ahead.
Well, I would say this is also another sermon, but there's a twist ending there that we think the whole time that his power comes from how great a scholar he is. And the last line reveals that his power comes from his grief, that he's been wronged. And somehow that actually brings him closer to God. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, it all comes from God. The question is, in this case, his grief, I think what happens is in this case, his grief means that his, that something wild has entered into the world. I mean, he's a very controlled man. And I think that what happens at the end is his grief is so powerful that he loosens his control over the power, and he destroyed his brother-in-law, who was his friend, who was his colleague, who was his fellow student. And I mean, it's the grief is so powerful that he loses control, which is something, right? It's a wonderful observation. Thank you. All right, folks, let's call it a day. Take good care. We'll see each other in a couple of weeks, first week in March. Okay. We're going to take a look at another piece of Talmud. The piece of Talmud next time is going to deal with economics, money and debts and loans, and how the rabbis dealt with a problem in the Bible. And we're going to talk specifically about my other point, which is how the rabbis deal with the Bible when the Bible teaches something that can't happen. How do you deal with an impossible ethic, if you have to make it real? So we're going to talk about something called Hillel's Prose Bull, and that'll be next time. And we're going to ask Rabbi Skop to join us, and we're going to force him to teach so that Rabbi Feinstein can sit back and kfel. All right, everybody, take good care of yourselves, please. Tonight, 7:00, College of Jewish Studies. For everyone who wants to join us, our guest is Rabbi Donnie Massing, who is a scholar of Jewish music. He's going to talk about Israeli identity through Jewish music. So please join us tonight, okay? 7:00, Shabbos. We'll see you for Torah study. Everybody